Hey, everybody, this is Mike Belsky, co-founder of Product Collective, and we're back for another industry interview. Welcome, everybody. I know for many of you, this might be your first time. Others, I've seen some of the names in the attendee list. I've seen you here many times before. So regardless, welcome to this industry interview. I'm excited to have a very special guest with us, Scott Belsky, and we're going to get to chat with him in just a minute. Scott is a product person, an entrepreneur, is an author of the book, The Messy Middle. Also a past speaker at Industry. We were really fortunate to have him as the closing keynote at last year's edition of Industry. So I can't wait to get into the conversation with Scott, specifically about the topic of his book, The Messy Middle. But before we do that, I do want to just a couple of very quick things. If this is your first time here, I, again, welcome you, and hopefully we could have you back for many more of these and also have you involved with Product Collective. That's our community for product people. You could go to productcollective.com to check it out. There's also sorts of stuff there. We have a newsletter. We do these chats. We have an active Slack group where there's thousands of product people every day trading ideas and best practices. So join us there. Also, I just want to give a quick shout about Industry. In fact, the European edition of Industry is basically in like 2 months. So I'm really excited for that. We've got all sorts of folks that'll be with us there. Brian Norgard, the former chief product officer at Tinder, another author, and Dan Olson, author of the Lean Product Playbook, Melissa Perry, author of Escaping the Build Trap. So you could go to europe.industryconference.com to learn more. And then in September, we'll be back for our 5th global edition of Industry in Cleveland, Ohio. And we have lots of folks with us there. So I actually put a little link to it right here. It should be a little green button that y'all will see. And if you use a special code that I put there, you'd get 20% off your pass. That'll be good for the rest of this month. So check that out if you would like. But with all of that out of the way, I'd love to get right into our conversation because I'm sure that you have questions for Scott. I know I'll have questions for Scott. And if you do, by the way, there's an Ask a Question section. And at any time, feel free to add your questions there. I'll be monitoring that throughout. And I do invite you to do that because your questions will probably be a lot better than mine. So I'd rather you do that. So anyway, Scott, just thank you first for even joining us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, of course. Thanks for having me. And it's good to be with you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to sort of dive right into the topic of your book, The Messy Middle, which, I know you had prefaced this before, that a lot of entrepreneurs, even product people, they talk about that beginning story, what it took to create the company, especially when there's this amazing exit that might have happened. They talk about the end too, right? Like this big success story. But sometimes the in-between, the messy middle, that sometimes gets overlooked. And I'm just curious your take on, first of all, how else you might define that messy middle, and why do you think people don't often talk about that?
Yeah, well, it's, listen, like many of you, I get inspired by frustration. And that's oftentimes what inspires product ideas and new features. And in my case, this book. And for The Messy Middle, the frustration was with our obsession with the starts and finishes of everything and how pithy descriptions are given for how a new venture or product was conceived and executed that summarizes 5 years of volatility or more. What is the volatility? It's the ups and downs, right? It's the lows, like managing ambiguity, uncertainty, working with no end in sight, with no rewards along the way that keep you engaged. And it's also a highs where you realize something suddenly works, whether it's how the product is functioning, whether it's how the team is functioning, how you're working. There's just these moments where everything seems to be jiving. And it's those things you have to capitalize on and do more of in order to ultimately succeed and achieve what I like to call the positive slope, which is when every low is a little less low and every high is a little higher. And if you think about this volatility for a moment, we're not our best selves at either the lows or the highs. We're not our best selves at our lows, the lows of the journey, because we start to make the decisions out of fear. We start to be worried about competitive pressure. We start to be worried about every other anxiety that comes up in the midst of building something with no end in sight. and how you manage those lows and make sure that you make great decisions, is what the endurance section of the book is all about. It's also true that we're not our best selves at the highs. At the highs, we start to falsely attribute the things that we did to the things that worked, and we start to become driven with, in some ways, false pretenses, and it's at these moments where we have to stay paranoid. We have to stay a little pragmatic, or a little sort of doubtful that tasks will actually get done. One of my management philosophies these days is to be very optimistic about the future, but very pessimistic and paranoid about the present. I love that combo. I think it's actually very helpful for managing the volatility of a project. You have to be a great narrator and driver of this forward vision, but also like really practical about where you are and what's not working. So that was the impetus of this book, for the messy middle, and some insights on how it relates to product.
That's awesome. And I'm curious, having gone through your entrepreneurial experience, you co-founded or founded Behance, and that was acquired. That was a super successful story. You could have chosen to write about that, like just the success of what happened and this glamorous piece, but you chose to pour everything into the all of the interviews that you've done for the book, just all the work that went into it, into that messy middle part. And I'm just curious, like, why were you so passionate about that in the middle piece? And why do you think like that is what entrepreneurs and product people really need to hear about?
Yeah, well, I think that the middle is wildly misunderstood, and it's nuts because it's a period of volatility that is actually easier to remember, or harder to remember, than it is to forget. It's funny, when I started the project, I said, okay, well, I should at least first start to go back to my 5 years of bootstrapping Behance and trying to figure out where the heck we were going and how to make this work. And I couldn't remember the granularity of those 5 years before we were venture backed and started to have real growth and inflection. And then, 2 years later, we got acquired. But that 5 years was kind of hard for me to remember. And what I ended up doing is I went to my phone and I like flipped back to like the screenshots and photos of that early, that not necessarily just early, but that 5 year period of volatility. And I realized through the photos, through the screen captures of bugs and things to send to the team, through the screen caps of what people were saying about us on Twitter or, in online forums in the design world, there was a lot of, I got some sense of like what it was like to surf that, sea of anonymity. So I did try to, all along the way, by the way, I was always I'm a writer, so I like to write things down when they come to my mind. When I am debating or reconciling something in my head, I like to write it down. It sort of like helps me come to a consensus or conclusion, at least, on where what I want to do. And so I've always been writing down, and even as an investor, since 2010, working with other entrepreneurs and being on boards and, being on 1 a.m. phone calls with founders, or being in product reviews of other companies as a guest, I would oftentimes write things down, like observations, insights that I heard or felt, in those experiences. So this book was culling all those, into what ultimately became 3 groups. There are a lot of insights fell in endurance, how to manage and navigate through those lows. A lot of them fell through optimization, how to optimize the things that are working in product team itself. And then the third category of insights was what I ended up calling the final mile, which is sort of like, why does so much change, towards the end? Why do things fall apart? Why is there self-sabotage, towards the conclusion of a bold journey? And so those are the 3 categories of stories and insights, that ended up making it to the book.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's interesting how the book is broken up into those categories, so to speak. And you sort of touched up on this, but was it like what made you choose those 3 sections in particular? Was it reflecting back and you just realized like all those insights that you found when you're looking back historically, they just sort of fell naturally in there? Because I imagine there could be lots of different categories you could have come up with, but it seemed like those were special to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, those were the as I went through and culled through, it was actually 860 something notes in Evernote that were like in this collection that I had been amassing over the years. And I started to kind of try to tag them in order to find some themes. And those were the top level sort of themes that they all fell into. There was also a fourth theme called start, which I didn't, I wanted to write more about like what happens after the start. So that's where I ended up focusing and building the content into the book. But it's, listen, if you're a product leader, you are a narrator of the journey for your team. You are driving a car with the windows blacked out in the back seat and no one can see where they are. And they will usually feel like they are just sitting at a standstill in traffic. And it is your job as the narrator to merchandise the progress that your team is making back to the team. There's this, I talk about in the book, this woman named Teresa Mablé, who focuses on creativity in business as a researcher at Harvard Business School. And she did this big kind of journaling exercise with over 1,000 executives and companies. And ultimately, one of the biggest findings she found was that progress begets progress. When people feel like they are making progress, they're more likely to make more progress. But guess what? In a bold journey, building a product from zero, you don't feel like you're making progress most of the time. And so that job of the leader to help the team understand, okay, we're crossing state lines. We're not okay. Now we're past the bridge. Now we're past this milestone. Now progress begets progress. I think it's a huge part of it. The other thing I would just say that I really think is important for everyone, this is one of those themes that came out of the book for me, meeting with a lot of different teams, is about rewards and like short circuiting the reward system of your team so you can stay engaged on a incremental basis for a long pursuit. I mean, think about it. When you're super inspired by what you want to build or where you want to be, that is enough to leave your job, to take a risk and join a new team, whatever. However, when it gets to the day-to-day grind, and again, feeling like you're in those lows, you're working in anonymity and nothing's working and whatever, you need to be engaged with some short-term rewards because that's how we're biologically tuned. 200 years ago or so, the average lifespan was 27 years old, yet alone 10,000 years ago when it was a lot lower than that. We need short-term rewards to feel like we're making progress. The notion of signing up for a 5 to 7 year potential outcome is sort of against our own biology. And so there are a lot of fun things that teams do to hack their reward system. For us, there are some fun ones. Like, for example, when we would type in Behance into Google, it always said, do you mean enhance? Do you mean enhance? And we were determined at one point to no longer be a mistake. And lo and behold, like after all this SEO work and getting portfolios built for customers and just doing a lot of work, in 6 months, we were able to suddenly be a legitimate search term. When you typed in Behance, it said enhance. And this is back in like 2007, 2008. And I kid you not, Beyonce became super popular 6 months later and we lost our SEO all over again. But, things like that, things like I've been a lifelong vegetarian and the development team thought it would be fun to get me to agree to eat certain types of meat at certain milestones of our journey. This was just us hacking our own reward system to keep the team engaged, the culture fun, long enough to figure it out. And by the way, I would say like that is one of my biggest takeaways from successful ventures is sticking together long enough to figure it out is probably the ultimate competitive advantage in that world.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. One of the things I did want to ask you, and I see some audience questions coming in, so I'm definitely going to get to some of those, but you had this experience at Behance but you could have, again, used just your own personal experiences to write this book. I'm sure you've had a ton. You've talked about all the notes that you took, but you actually interviewed lots and lots of other entrepreneurs for the book. And now, advising companies, investing in companies, you talk with entrepreneurs every day. I'm curious, in your research for the book, like what's surprised you the most? You've had your own personal experience, but as you're talking to others, were there things that stood out that just happened to surprise you as you were doing that research?
Yeah, I think that there were certainly a lot of like counterintuitive things that came up throughout the process for me. A number of them, things like the benefit of fighting, and how some of the most productive teams have a culture that condones fighting because to them that is indicative of the fact that people care enough about the solution and it's a diverse enough that people have different solutions, legitimate proposals from their expertise, all of which is different. And so in a truly productive, diverse, engaged, experienced team, you are going to have fighting. And actually what you need to do is fight apathy ruthlessly. You have to keep people engaged in the fight. So there was some stuff like that. I think, a number of insights around also, though, not fighting to consensus, like not always striving to have everyone agree, and how a lot of the greatest decisions are ultimately made when there is passionate disagreement as well. And while people may agree to commit, you're going to, someone's just pounding the table saying, like, I know this, I have an intuition and I don't care what the data says, like, we have to try this and see if it works. And, there are a lot of stories about how that, serves teams, and in this data-driven world where everyone's trying to strive to consensus with all of the different, data available to them. I think that's also sort of a good thing to keep in mind. So I think there were some things like that. And also the final mile stuff. It's very seldom discussed what happens right before a product launches, right before a book is launches, right before a company is acquired or goes public or goes bankrupt. There's a lot of churn that happens, as leaders, especially product-minded leaders. We are unprepared for what happens in that final mile. And so there was some counterintuitive, stuff around, how to separate yourself from your work, even though you define yourself by your work, that I thought were interesting.
Yeah, I think that is great. Some of those things they don't necessarily seem intuitive. Having a team that isn't necessarily just kumbaya all the time, but actually does engage with each other, maybe even fight with each other. But that could be a good thing, actually. So yeah, I like that. I'm going to some audience questions now, so I want to make sure. And one of the questions revolved around this person being on a team that they're trying to get to that next level, but the way that they put it was, we don't know what we don't know. And they pointed out, how do you help teams, or I guess what should teams keep in mind when they're going from the small to medium and medium to large, sort of like getting to that next level?
Yeah. Well, a couple things. I mean, first of all, one of my favorite rules in business, especially with building new products and stages of ventures, is that the playbook is the perfect playbook until it's the absolute wrong playbook, and you have to know when to discard the playbook at what point. In terms of the tools you use for how to manage, the way you conduct meetings, the roles that people are playing on your team, when everything is just working and you achieve that through a lot of work, right? It will work until it stops working. And then you have to switch it up all over again. Literally, move people around, have people sit in different seats. Really question whether the person that was perfect for their job before is still perfect for their job today and in the future. And if not, move people around, give people new experiences, bring in new DNA. It's so important to constantly, it's almost like the discontinuity is the greatest effort towards continuity. Like, in order to continue to thrive and scale and grow, you have to keep shaking shit up. And that's just, that's part of it. Now, part of that, practically speaking, is this notion of A/B testing the way that you work as a team. So just because you have a meeting every Tuesday in the morning, or just because you have a scrum, or just because you always send this email around after every meeting, doesn't mean you always should. Maybe you should test 3 weeks of doing it a different way, or not doing it at all, and then decide after that period of time, were we more productive? Did we use our resources better? Or should we revert back to the previous version? So this is what I mean by optimizing and making sure that not only your product is being A/B tested, but your team and yourself, like your own tendencies and workflows and patterns, are also being optimized. And the final thing I would say is just embrace resourcefulness as a muscle you build. I think that we as teams typically, as we scale and grow, we just want to throw more people and more money at the problems that we have, when in fact the answer is typically to refactor, then hire. And A lot of the startups that have failed fastest in my portfolio were the ones that raised the most money right away and then used the resources to solve their problems, as opposed to build the resourcefulness to solve the problem and become more capable in the future. So resourcefulness is more important.
Yeah, which is another sometimes counterintuitive thing to think about. We think, well, gosh, if we only had more money, we could be so much farther. But that's not necessarily the case if you're not using that money the right way. I like that. You mentioned team, and actually one of the audience questions did center around team. The question was, what tips might you have on how to narrate that journey and progress with the rest of your team, which might include the rest of your product team, but also leadership too?
Yep. Yeah, sure. And, it's funny, think about the big industry of marketing and how $100 billion of creative production annually is done towards marketing and promotion, billboards, ads, and cool graphics that compel us to take action on things, to buy things, to do things, to think about the world around us differently. Are we using any of those same tools to get ourselves and our teams to think differently, to compel ourselves and our teams to take action and to prioritize differently in the workplace? I'm a big fan of merchandising not only progress, but also action and narrative and goals and priorities to the team in creative ways. Whether it means making up visual versions of the business plan that can get alignment for people, making sure that we always show a prototype, in a distant future prototype of the state of the product, in the distant future, and use that as a force of alignment. I always like to say that a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings, right? If everyone can sort of see how something should work, they don't have to talk about it anymore. It's really important to find like visual, compelling ways of merchandising back to the team why we're here, what we're going to do next, and where we're going. And that is the narrator's job. That is the leader's job in any respect within a team or within an organization. But here's the thing, is that leaders feel like it's repetition. Leaders feel like they are saying the same thing over and over. This feels fake to me. Why should I have to market internally? I should focus only on marketing to my customers. It's just not true. We're all human beings. We're all allured and incentivized by the same mechanisms. And it's important. Internal marketing matters.
Yeah, there's actually one more question around dealing with leadership, and I thought I'd ask it here too. The question is more about, okay, hey, we're at a point where our product team, we're now in a place where we are okay with failing. We can learn from failing. We can embrace that. But the management team still views failing as failing. And, how might we be able to work with the management team to start to see some of the benefits from, what we can learn when something doesn't go right?
Listen, you have to manage expectations of leaders as to like the state of a project and whether it is an experiment or a test or something you're doing with conviction, and also how you'll measure the value, coming out of it. It's one thing, if you say, hey, we're launching this major product and we're going to change the world, and then you come back 6 months later with your tail between your legs, you're like, oh, we didn't. It's going to be viewed as a failure and in a negative way. But if you say, listen, like our end state or our ultimate problem we're trying to solve is this. There are 5 possible ways to solve this problem. We're only going to choose one at a time, and we're going to test it. And whatever we learn from that, we're going to apply to the next attempt at solving the problem in a different way. And we don't expect to get it right the first time. In fact, we want to just get it right by the last experiment. And this is the time frame that we're going to do these experiments in. And this is how we're measuring ourselves. One of the things that teams should do that they don't do the most often is set their own measures. Like, don't let someone else define what success looks like for you and your team. Define it for yourself. Get buy-in beforehand. And then remind people, here's what we discussed. Here's what happened. We are delivering on expectations. It's a big part of that. And again, it's one of those things where true product purists are like, oh, I don't want to deal with this, management and bureaucracy and storytelling and BS. Like, I just want to get this stuff done. it's part of your job. Like part of your job, you are a a sort of a steward of the journey of everyone else around you, and you have to carry them with you in order to be successful as a product leader.
I want to jump back to your book because really there's over 100 different takeaways that people can get when they read your book. And if any of you attended industry, you already have the book, so you've already been able to take in a lot of these. But for those yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh, I say that because we surprised all of our attendees last year with the book. So for those that weren't there, maybe they don't have the book quite yet. And one recommendation is definitely read The Messy Middle. I think it's awesome. But for product people in particular that haven't gone through it, what are maybe one or two big takeaways that stand out to you that apply to entrepreneurs, but also product people too?
Yeah, well, listen, it's funny. I actually shaded a section of the book in the middle that is shaded a different color because it is my product book within the book. Like I actually wanted to write a book on the messy middle of product, and I decided to kind of bring it into a book within a book. But so there's a bunch of takeaways in that section. I think a couple, relate to the importance of the first mile experience. The crazy irony that the last mile of a team's experience building a product is typically spent building the first mile of the customer's experience using the product. And that is the top of the funnel of every product experience. That matters more than any other part of the product, because if you can't get people through the door, then they're not going to notice and enjoy what's in the store, right? And so how do you think differently about that first mile? How do you optimize it? And also, how do you ground yourself with who the customer is in that part of their experience? They don't have any faith in your product yet. They don't have any sense of the value that they will get. At that point, I like to say they are lazy, vain, and selfish. You need to meet them where they are, and you need to consider them as a totally different customer in that first 30 to 60 seconds than what you believe they will be, for the rest of their time using your product. So I talk a lot about that and about how to keep the first mile, front and center, as you're iterating product. I would say that's like one I would call out as one of my favorites, at least.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I'd love to keep chatting with you, but we're at the end of our time. But I know that people can get a hold of you in other ways on Twitter, and maybe if you could just let folks know how they can find out more about the book too, that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. So I'm just at Scott Belsky on Twitter. That is my preferred medium of sharing whatever comes to mind and is exciting to me. And I also love connecting with other folks and learning from many of you. So if you're not using Twitter, check it out. But I mean, also I'm an active angel investor. I'm always interested in helping entrepreneurs solving really interesting problems and easy to reach. So thanks again for having me on the show. And I love this also community and what this means for product leaders around the country.
Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it, and to everybody that joined us for today, appreciate it, and hopefully you could join us in the future for some upcoming industry interviews. So we'll see everybody later, and thanks again, Scott.
Thank you, guys.